Okay, coming to the post-scientific period, which is roughly after the two physicists' work, so you could say late 19th to early 20th century. This is a time when people started studying human mind systematically, and there were several different perspectives on how to study human mind. There are two things. What made these different schools of thought differ from one another? We can trace back the methodology we adapt now to these different schools of thoughts. The idea is this: these schools of thought differed in terms of what they thought was appropriate to study human mind scientifically and what method they thought was um, objective to study human mind. What and how should we study were the two main things that differentiated one school of thought from the other. These were the earliest schools of thought. I mean, there were no scientific studies before this, at least not that we know of. The modern psychology is a continuation or a different version of these first schools of thought. And we look at the two most influential ones from that time. One is structuralism and the other one is functionalism. Now, let's first talk about structuralism. So, structuralism, although the name itself was not given at the time, if I remember correctly, was founded by William Wundt in Germany. William Wundt is the psychologist who established the first psychological laboratory in Germany in Leipzig in 1879. The year 1879, for the same reason, is often referred to as the birth year of psychology in general. William Wundt is referred to as the father of psychology. The topic of study, according to Wundt, was consciousness. And the method he adopted was called introspection. Introspection is the methodology, and consciousness is the topic. There's a story about how Wundt, as a kid, used to daydream and start thinking about things. Well, some say maybe that helped him to select consciousness as a topic of study when he established this laboratory. And because he used to introspect or reflect on his own thoughts, introspection was a methodology he adopted. Well, who knows? Well, in a typical experiment, those days in one's laboratory, participants would be presented by objects like these. Um, and participants were trained to describe the impressions of this object without taking its name, talk about its color, shape, texture, and feeling. So you would say round, shiny, red, as opposed to apple. It's not necessarily visual. People used to sniff something and describe the feelings they experienced. So the idea was whatever consciously you are experiencing, if you can break that conscious experience into its individual components, that will help you understand how the mind gives us the collective experience based on the individual components. It's more like knowing the atomic structure of physical objects. Wundt was trying to figure out the individual atoms of conscious experience. This is just an analogy. He was interested in determining the rules that gives us consciousness, how we go from individual components to bigger combined experience. There were two renowned students who later on popularized Wundt's work. One of them was Tishner. Remember, Wundt's work was mostly in German, and hardly any other English-speaking nations had access to German literature. So Tishner popularized or spread Wundt's work in English-speaking nations like the US. The name itself, structuralism, about the structure of the human conscious, because you're trying to determine the individual components associated with human mind. So the other student was Stanley Hall. In fact, he was the first student who worked at the laboratory, and he had a great significant contribution, especially um, um, he's known for things like in established the psychological laboratory in the U.S. at Johns Hopkins. He also founded what is now called as the American Psychological Association in '92 and served as its first president. Well, he played a key role in the development of psychology as a scientific field in the U.S. Yet, you'll see that he's not referred to as the father of American psychology. William James is referred to as the father of American psychology. We'll talk about more in a second about William James. Now, so the second school of thought at that time was called functionalism. And while structuralism was founded by a German scientist, functionalism was founded by an American scientist. In fact, William James was a medical doctor. And you can imagine, because he was a doctor, was interested in um, healing people. His idea was to study the functions, purpose of human behavior, not the structure. Everything the mind can do and does has some function to it, has a purpose to it. And so according to him, it's not the structure that scientists study of human mind, rather it is the function. He was influenced by a Darwinian idea of how environment changes. And then this, you can connect the same thing to the Confucius idea of the role of environment in changing human behavior. So our behavior adapts, and every behavior has some evolutionary importance to it. And understanding that, according to him, should be the topic of psychology. So if you look at it, we discussed pre-scientific, scientific, post-scientific. Now we need to get back to modern era where we'll talk about behaviorism, gestalt psychology, psychoanalysis, and cognitive psychology.